All right, so should be able to,
Okay.
yeah.
So before we launch back into dynamic capabilities, I want to see if there's any comments anyone has on Brian's talk, or any questions you might have to me about Brian's talk, or any follow-up that you would like me to make with Brian. Did you find that interesting, or a distraction?
I
Any
have a
comment
quick
on that?
question. I have a quick question,
Please.
Professor. I did find the lecture to be extremely useful, and I think he made me think about technology in ways that I hadn't. So one of the questions that I had was because he mentioned that they like to get involved in the process early on to try and like tweak the innovation in a certain direction such that it's not infringing on other patents. Are there also times that you've seen where, you just outright tell somebody that this is a great idea, but it is not protectable and therefore abandon it? Or are there like ways around it?
Yes. Well, let me answer that question, because I do some angel investing, and it's just remarkable to me how individual inventors and companies get through an A round, and they're not really thought through the question of how they're going to protect what they got. And there's two companies that I'm involved in where they were planning to sell a product. That was their commercialization strategy. And I managed to stop them both and say, the minute that product gets out there, you're going to be reverse engineered and the game's over. And let's go to a services model where we're going to use trade secrets to protect. So we'll provide the service. We're never going to let the trade secrets out of the building, so to speak. And what was remarkable to me is how easy it was to change their mind. Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Well, but it wasn't like it was something that was hard. It's just they hadn't thought about it. So I feel that certainly around, it comes up around what I call business model issues, designing the business model. They forget to think about IP. And I think, if big time VC money comes along, they're going to make sure these questions get asked. But there's a lot of effort that goes in before big time VC shows up. That could be done much more smartly, so to speak, if people really understood IP questions. And even the VC guys are not very sophisticated in my mind, because it involves sort of bringing technology and legal perspectives together. And as we've discussed before, that's often hard to do. And a guy like Brian's actually a pretty rare guy who kind of works all three sides, the technical side, the legal side, and the business side. And that's why I asked the question, how come this philosophy and culture existed at a place like Philips and at IBM and at Texas Instruments, but not elsewhere? And I think it's got something to do with leadership, and it's got something to do with experience. Once I've been embroiled in some big intellectual property battles, either they've lost some technology or they've gotten some big benefit from a patent, then they start getting sophisticated. But until they have a school of hard knocks experience, they tend to drift. That's my view. There's actually the paper in the reading list by myself and Stephen Johnson. You might want to read that. He's an experienced IP attorney, and we wrote that together as sort of a bit of a handmaiden or an assist for people to be sensitive to these issues. See, and you might just want to pull that paper out and circulate it around again to remind people that is sort of relevant. Any other remarks? Good question. All right, if there aren't any other questions, let's dwell again on dynamic capabilities and competitive advantage. Or if you want to call it, this is all about corporate greatness and corporate longevity. You're aware of the statistics that very few companies exist for 2 or 3 decades, let alone for a century. and those companies that are ahead, they're in quote the top 10, don't stay in the top 10 for very long. So, and with deeper and deeper uncertainty and more rapid change, staying a leader in the industry, it becomes rarer and rarer. So when you find a company like Sherwin-Williams, and I don't think anybody else other than myself, these are some class teaching notes I'm sharing with you, no one else has written up this company at all. It's sort of, analysts don't pay a lot of attention to it. It's a successful publicly traded company, but it's sort of ignored. But to me, a company that's got a 100-year history of being a leader in the industry is actually a pretty rare thing and worthy of some attention. So I actually went back and found a little bit of the history of the company and found that it was remarkably supportive. The decisions that the company made, in my mind, were remarkably supportive of the dynamic capabilities framework. So it's a bit of good old-fashioned management 101 plus dynamic capabilities. So let's go back 200 years and ask, what did the paint industry look like? Well, the paint industry really hadn't had any innovation for the previous 200, 300 years. That, the time that, the Declaration of Independence was signed, people understood there were paints around, but there was only one paint. It was white lead and oil. It wasn't a mixed paint. You took something called white lead and you mixed it with oil and you stirred it, and you had a professional painter paint things. There was no such things as water-based paints. There were no such things, or colors were hard to come by. Go back to the Romans and the Greeks and the Chinese, for that matter, colors were, didn't stay very long. And there was, really only very limited 1 or 2 or 3 different types of paints or wall washing materials. So, essentially thousands of years with very little innovation. And then along comes Sherwin-Williams. And what they invented was essentially pre-mixed paints. By pre-mixed paints, I mean paints that you didn't necessarily have to mix, or you didn't need a craft person to come and mix for you. And what they did was they focused on building quality paints, producing quality paints with pure ingredients. And then they brought science to the paint business. White lead, which was the standard, was created by essentially creating an environment where that white stuff that is on the batteries of your car terminal, that essentially the terminals of your battery, that's white lead. And it was essentially a manufacturing process to accelerate that kind of lead corrosion, and that was the primary ingredient in paints. But there was only, as I said, one type of paint, but they brought chemistry. Sherwin-Williams established a research lab and brought chemistry to the business of paint. So point 1 is bringing science and engineering to the business. Point 2 is not going to sell you a one-size-fits-all paint. We're going to start to develop paints for every service. 2 very simple ideas, and that's kind of what animates the company today. So Sherwin and Williams were the 2 founders. This is way back in the 1890s. Don't pay attention to November 2013. That's the date when I wrote this first version of this, an early version of this class notes. So they started developing finishes for everything, not for automobiles until a little bit later, but for railroad equipment, locomotives, passengers, freight cars, for wood, for cement, for other kinds of materials. So it was all about trying to get the right paint for the right service. And this is not just a question, it's not just a question of cosmetics, how it looks. We're actually talking about preserving real property. I mean, you'll notice the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge gets continuously painted. If it wasn't painted, it probably would be in the bay by now because of corrosion. So, with steel in particular, requires constant maintenance. And if you don't paint it, it will corrode. So we're actually talking about preserving trillions of dollars of capital stock. And all you had to do is to go behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War and look at what happened in Russia and Czechoslovakia and places like that, where, particularly Russia, where there was 100 years of socialism and no maintenance of buildings, and the place is incredibly decrepit. The buildings start to fall down if they're not maintained and if they're not painted. So, so we're talking about something other than aesthetics. We're talking about creating a product that preserves capital. So what was the strategy that Sherwin-Williams had? And they were actually quite explicit about it. And they really wanted to produce a paint for every surface. But in fact, the original inventors, the original company founders, were really not. I mean, we've been telling a story of Silicon Valley where the dynamic capabilities comes from the founders. I would say in the case of Sherwin-Williams, the hero is this guy Cunningham, who came in after Sherwin-Williams. He was a natural leader. He was a force to be reckoned with, what they call a human dynamo, had lots of energy and inspiration. So it's that highly charged, highly talented, eye-charging person that sounds like a Steve Jobs, he sounds like Jeff Bezos, or he sounds like an Elon Musk, but he's in fact, a fellow that's 100 years, lived 100 years before them. But here's what he says: our company is not an imitator, but an originator or an innovator. It is not a follower, but a leader. It is not afraid to act when it is right. So there's decisiveness, not afraid to act, no analysis paralysis, but willing to make the decisions, even when there's uncertainty about the outcome, even when you can't calculate what the NPV is, even when to a lot of people it looks risky. Look at this quote here. This is a quote from the story of Sherwin-Williams back in the 50s. And we're talking about the period when Cunningham is in charge, which 1909 to 1914. And what do they say? This witnessed a tremendous expansion of Sherwin-Williams manufacturing distribution. So they went a national strategy to begin with. New plants were built, others enlarged, warehouses and depots were opened up in the Mississippi Valley area, the Southwest, all over. Dry column manufacturing was expanded. The factory was established in Detroit. So step one is this is seizing. This is actually building out a national company. And remember, back then, most businesses were regional or local or statewide, and national businesses were rare, let alone international businesses. But, it's not just about a strategy, it's also about having a culture at Sherwin-Williams. And actually, this is sort of instructive, because it says it's good to be enthusiastic about what you sell. Because at the end of the day, someone has to sell this paint. And you've got to be proud of your firm. It's even greater if you can instill enthusiasm in others and your firm and your goods and yourself. So it's about being proud of what you've got and being willing to show up at work and give the little bit of extra measure. That's how you get to great success. So the culture, this is really, Charles O'Reilly was here. He would say, yes, this is exactly right. You need a culture of commitment where everybody's pulling on the oars. So let's see if we can fit this into the dynamic capabilities framework and also Professor Ramelt's strategy kernel. Remember, this is just to remind you, we've got sensing, seizing, and transforming as part of dynamic capabilities. And for Professor Ramelt, we've got diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent action. And I think you can see here that this fits quite well with Sherwin-Williams. Coherent actions are feasible policies, resource commitments, and actions designed to carry out the policy. I'm quoting from Ramelt here. Sherwin-Williams, this is my assessment, seems to have implicitly behaved consistent with Ramelt's criteria. And I'll try to explain this on the next slide. Diagnosis. Okay, so what is it that Sherwin-Williams is doing? Well, as I said before, the paint industry before Sherwin-Williams, there was no home painting. There were artisans called master painters. They really controlled the decisions about what paints to put on the surface, and nobody painted their own home. No farmer painted his own barn. You would need to get in a master painter, and they'd have to mix up this white lead and oil, and they made that seem like it was rocket science. And it was actually, you were dealing with toxic materials, and it was, required a special mechanism of mixing, special art to mixing. And what they really wanted to do was simplify it and make what's called prepared paints. And all paints we buy today are prepared paints. So Sherwin-Williams realized there wasn't a prepared paint, and they were going to make one using science. The guiding policy was the following. There were 4 components to it. Produce a high quality, honest, prepared paint that will demonstrate the superiority of prepared paints over white lead and oil. So there's some very basic values here about giving good measure and being honest and not being fraudulent, because back in these years, people were touting, if you look up who invented paint in Wikipedia, there are many, many different claimants. There were a lot of people that claimed to invent paint, and there were a lot of what we would call snake oil salesmen running around talking about how their paint was better. It's like the early days of the automobile industry when we didn't know what a good paint was really all about. We didn't know what a good automobile was really all about until the Model T Ford. So in this time period, they focused on being honest and building a reputation and demonstrating through science the superiority of their products. They wanted to show that the base product, they still had to deal with the incumbent artisan painters. And so they didn't try to disintermediate. This is different from Uber. Uber decided to completely disintermediate the taxis, right? They didn't go in and try and fix taxis at the same time. But in the case of Sherwin-Williams, they decided to try and fix, at least we'll try and make the traditional guys that do the white lead and oil, we're going to make higher quality white lead and oil ingredients for them so that we keep them on site. The Uber founder could have taken a lesson from this, because at the end of the day, where Uber's had trouble is dealing with local cities that want to protect their local taxi service. And the certain cities in the world, Uber is not allowed because Uber's not yet figured out a strategy of co-option. But good old Sherwin and Williams and Cunningham, way smarter than Uber founders. They knew that they had a traditional constituency, namely the traditional painters, and so they tried to help them too by giving them a better product. And then they provided a strong warranty to back up their claims, very unusual in those days. Then they made colors popular to undermine the purveyors of white lead and oil. So it'd be like Uber saying, yes, okay, you can, if you want a basic car service, you can use the taxis, and we're going to make taxis even better. But if you really want something different and better and more flexible, then you use Uber. What was their marketing strategy? As I said, it was to win the hearts and minds of the master painters because they had referential value. through what is called ODP, which is Old Dutch paint. It was actually the Dutch that invented this white lead and oil paint back in the 1600s. And so this outlines the fact that the company was trying to keep the traditional lead paint purveyors on side. The quote here this is from the corporate newspaper. The reason we've been able to actually pull together this story is they used to put out a monthly or a quarterly newsletter for their employees that's you can find in a few of the libraries in Cleveland. I think Sherwin-Williams is headquartered in Cleveland. So there they explained that they were bringing in colors and trying to get away from mixed paints. So the marketing strategy was not only national in scope, but it was actually appealing to new sets of customers by offering colors. You could have, if Henry Ford, you could have a Model T Ford in any color so long as it was black. And before Sherwin-Williams, you could have paint in any color so long as it was white or cream. And there was an effort to get away from that and finding new colors. So how did they do that? They did it through R&D. In the very early years, formulations for coatings were largely a matter of experience obtained through trial and error and based on a limited number of ingredients supplied by nature. It was, just like the Greeks and the Romans, they had colors too in their paintings, but they found pigments in nature. That's where they got them from. Whereas in the case of Sherwin-Williams, they used science and chemistry to attain their goals with far greater certainty. So no longer the hit and miss of finding the right clay and the right, and you couldn't get consistency, of course, if you're relying on clays. You would often have a lot of trouble, and you couldn't market nationally because you'd be manufacturing your paints in different regions with different clays, and it was all a big mess. So to standardize and get predictability, they used modern chemistry to drive the colors. So that was, it sounded very straightforward, but it was an innovation. And then also, if the corporate social responsibility people were here, they would say yes. And from the very beginning, a company that pursued notions of good corporate social responsibility, which to Sherwin and Williams meant a good reputation, giving good measure. In other words, don't shortchange the customer, and good quality. So in this sense, they're like Jeff Bezos. We want to make the customer happy. Customer first is our approach. And then they go on to say, and to avoid every trick that would save a penny at the expense of the other fellow. So we're not going to nickel and dime you, and we're not going to take every penny out of the cost if it sacrifices quality. And then, this is 100 years old, so 1916. Let's read what he says there. We live in the days of large affairs, and while principles never change, methods do, and great opportunity opens to those who have the ability to see and grasp them. Does that sound a bit like sensing and sense making? And you see the opportunity, grasping is seizing. So he's not using the language, the words dynamic capabilities, but that's really what he's trying to convey. He says, when I began business, a carload was 20 tons. Now it's 50 or more. In 1866, there was no through railroad to the Pacific, blah, 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 all of this stuff here. So it's all about keeping up with new discoveries, with inventions and developments. The world's changing. Because the world's changing, we need to change too. So it's really an assessment of the environment they're living in, marveling at the changes and the need for new types of paints for different types of surfaces. And if they can stay alert to change, the changing environment, they're going to succeed. So seeing opportunity where other people seeing constraints, but not just seeing the opportunity, it's also being the willingness to grasp them. So let me just pause there to see if any of this resonates true. Does it sound like dynamic capabilities? Or does it sound like something quite different to you folks? David, you always help me out. What do you think?
Me? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really liked kind of everything you wrote in this article, but yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think they do have strong dynamic capabilities. Yeah, I mean, I think the way they saw past just the white lead paint and kind of saw into colors. In fact, I appreciate the history. I have a friend that actually worked at Valspar, which is now owned by Sherwin-Williams. So I like looking back at that. But yeah, I think how they looked past that and looked into colors and kind of looking into what customers would want in terms of having, someone come into their homes and paint them. Yeah, I kind of saw that as leading towards strong dynamic capabilities.
Well, the other thing I didn't mention here that builds on that is these guys invented water-based paints. I mean, most of the paints we use today, you don't have to wash your brush down with turpentine, which is what I used to paint when I was a kid, and you used to wash your brush down with turpentine, and the water-based paints came in the 1950s. And then they invented the roller. I mean, just think of the productivity improvement of being able to roll on a surface. Innovation here from what looks like a stodgy old company. But in fact, they invented water-based paints and got us away from lead-based paints. Everybody in the world thinks that lead's not good, and it's not good around humans. It still happens to be the best thing to put on the bottom of your boat, or if you're painting the Golden Gate Bridge, but it has negative environmental characteristics. And the guys that got us away from lead and lead poisoning, because, kids could pick up chips of paint, lead-based paint, and get lead poisoning. So these guys, not necessarily pursuing the health aspects, that wasn't necessarily number one. It was just to create a better paint, and a paint that everybody could use. So, the fact that we can all paint our own homes is because of Sherwin-Williams. Otherwise, you would have to have the professional painter come in, mix the white leaded oil, and then putting it on. You really had to be strong, and you could only use a paintbrush for it, and it was very slow. Now, after 1955 or whenever it is they invented this stuff, you decide you want to change the color of your room, you could, roll on new paint on the weekend and have a party the following weekend. And you wouldn't have the smell either, except it would, look fresh and new, et cetera, et cetera. So coming up with water-based paints, so behind it all, remember we say the discovery process is about, not only open innovation, reaching for ideas from the outside, but having your own research and development to drive the process. So they actually, and I believe the paint roller was patented. And so you couldn't, anybody that used a paint roller from 1950 through to 1970 was probably paying Sherwin-Williams something. And I don't know about the white, the water-based paints. I don't know if they license them or how it diffused through the industry, but I do know the roller was a patented device. So it's sort of old-fashioned values about delivering value, paying attention to the customer, recognizing that the market is very fragmented, that really getting close to the customer, understanding that the automotive paints are different from marine paints, which in turn are different from what you need in the housing sector and what you need over glass. And there's literally tens of thousands of SKUs today with paint. So I think some part of the success of Sherwin-Williams is related to their strategy and their dynamic capabilities. And this guy Cottingham, he was really the one that sort of put it all in motion. Which, by the way, talking about Sherwin-Williams, let's talk about another company with Williams in the name, which is Williams-Sonoma. The different Williams, but it was really not Williams that drove it. It was Howard Lester, of the guy who gave the Haas School, the Lester Center on Entrepreneurship. Howard Lester was sort of the cutting edge of Williams-Sonoma by taking that brand from a small local brand to a national brand. There are many parallels here to this guy Cunningham. But what sort of strikes me as the importance, they were really not trying to get rich quickly. They were not out to make money. It was out to build a great company, to give good service, to give full measure to the customer, to build a reputation. It's back to John Kay's obliquity notion. The way you maximize profit is by not focusing on maximizing profit. If you focus on maximizing profit, you often won't achieve profitability or durability. Not to say that when you look back on it, you don't say, well, gee, what they did, actually, yes, you can interpret that as an effort to be profitable longer term, but it's not focusing on profit, it's focusing on other things which are instrumental in achieving a customer satisfaction, and then in turn driving that through a viable business model. Any other comments on that?
I had a comment, Professor. I don't know about Williams-Sonoma, but back to Sherwin-Williams. I thought it was also really interesting the seizing aspect of what they did, especially the entering wedge strategy. Just because you've talked a lot about disruption and like how sometimes incumbents sort of topple the whole system, but they had a really clever strategy there to basically create a migration path with the existing master painters, and they didn't fully displace them, but even made a better product for them. I thought that was really clever.
Yeah, actually, as I'm thinking about this now, it's a very interesting comment on the disruption story, because they disrupted a craft industry, but they also co-opted it while trying to disrupt it. They co-opted it in the sense of bringing the master painter online, giving the master painter the last hurrah by giving him the best quality white lead and oil, but at the same time, so it's actually, in some sense, feeding your competitor, but it was to make sure that they stay on side with the master painters, who were so referential, because no one would put paint on the wall until they called up a painter. Back in those days, it wasn't something that the homeowner ever did. No homeowner ever painted their house. Hard for us to imagine. And of course, I know most of you paint your houses, and I used to paint boats, but I don't think I ever painted a house. But I wish I was a house painter sometime, because you get immediate feedback as to whether what you're doing is any good. Whereas if you're doing research on dynamic capabilities, you got to wait 20, 30 years before you find out if it's any good. Any other comments on this? Jackie? John, are you over there somewhere? All right, well, let's move on to... Sorry. Go ahead, please. Okay. Let's go ahead back into dynamic capabilities. There's a paper that I wrote in 2016, or got published in 2016, where I tried to pull together some of these very different ideas and relate them. For instance, you must have read Gary Hamel's work saying agility matters, agility matters, agility matters. And that's how companies get to be dynamic. They just got to be agile. And what I've tried to say to you folks is agility is not enough. You need strategy as well as agility. And sometimes flexibility always costs you something. If you can get away without being flexible, if you can stay focused for a while, you can get greater efficiency. Let me move to a diagram which I have in here, which see if this helps you understand the trade-offs. Every time you try and change things, someone somewhere in the company is going to say, gee, why don't we standardize on something and be it a product or be it a system, and that way, if you standardize something, then I can focus on getting the cost out of it, manufacturing it cheaply. So what I'm trying to do with this chart here is say that different business models kind of look at this efficiency agility trade-off differently. But if you're going to have strong dynamic capabilities, you need to move out where somehow or other for every unit of efficiency you sacrifice, you get the maximum amount of agility back. So it's a matter of finding the right mix, I suppose. What I'm doing here is saying the world is not 0-1. You'll find one set of books that'll tell you efficiency is what you should pursue, and another set of books and theorems, particularly from organizational behavior people, that'll say, don't worry about efficiency, just focus on agility. But surely there's some kind of a trade-off between the two. And of course, the efficiency folks don't recognize the trade-off, and the agility folks who tell you that agility is core, they don't recognize the trade-offs either. But I think that there are ways in which you can combine a certain amount of agility with efficiency. And one way to do it with products, of course, is with software. It used to be that to make a different product, you had to change the hardware. But today, you just take a standard product and change the software, and like Tesla, you can update the performance of the Tesla without taking it, into the shop. You can just download, a different operating system, or you can change elements of the operating system. So software is something which enables you to work this trade-off in a very, very different way from what used to be possible. So I just throw this out there to indicate that there are complex trade-offs between efficiency and agility, and there's different business models that exploit those trade-offs. And so just, recognize that there are choices here, I suppose, is one of the key things that I'm trying to say. Let's also address the fact that the context in which one is frequently using dynamic capabilities in the tech sector today is one where there's an ecosystem. So, the sensing, seizing, and transforming mantra, ask yourself the question, how does that work when the nature of competition is ecosystem to ecosystem? And I think, how does it work when, you're actually running an ecosystem or within an ecosystem, because there's both cooperation and competition inside an ecosystem. So what here we're looking at is iOS as a platform. And, the point here is that sensing and seizing has to be looked at in a systems context. And the very nature of an ecosystem, of course, it's a system. And it can't be thought of in a linear way. You sense and then you seize and so forth. This all happens simultaneously. And you have to think about multiple elements of the ecosystem at one time. Now, in the case of Sherwin-Williams, was there an ecosystem? Well, kind of. There were, the master painters, there were different industrial groups, different users, but there wasn't a platform. You didn't have an integrated platform like Apple has to deal with today, or that PayPal deals with. So I think what we're saying here, at least what I'm saying, and I put it out to you to think about, is that when there are ecosystems, the sensing and seizing things becomes a lot more complicated, but also a lot more important. That you have to pay attention to all these different constituents, and that somebody has to manage this, and the company that's at the core of the ecosystem, there has to be some intelligence at the center. The crowd, it can't, the marketplace doesn't make this stuff happen automatically. It needs to be curated, it needs to be orchestrated, and that's what sensing is all about. It's actually, curating the ecosystem and setting rules. Like Apple's got certain rules with respect to what an app performance characteristics are. They don't take anything into the App Store. And that's because there are systems consequences if you do. So this is all new and very complicated stuff, but I would appreciate your feedback on this. You obviously know the various elements of these ecosystems. How is managing an ecosystem? How is the job of Apple different from the job of Cottingham at Sherwin-Williams? Does anyone want to have a go at that one?
I think one of the things to call out here maybe would be that if a painter did a bad job, it's not necessarily the paint's fault. But if the app crashed due to whatever reasons, because of the app, or if there were any privacy breaches because of the app, it's Apple's name and brand that's on the line here, which wasn't the case with Sherwin-Williams. So they have to be a lot more controlled, and they have to be a lot more collaborative almost to make sure that everything meets their quality standards.
All right, so it's a very interesting observation. So Cottingham's job is to make sure that the raw materials were the right quality, the manufacturing process, was conducted properly. But the challenge here, if it's Apple or if it's Facebook, just think about some of the challenges these companies are now facing with respect to content and controlling content and permitting certain things and trying to block others. That the reputational impacts are absolutely horrendous. Horrendous isn't the right word. Are magnified. So you're right. In a way, it's the Sherwin-Williams thing is a relatively simple life with certain key things to focus on. But here, you've also got to do this in real time. If content is being if some guy is shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, you got to get that content so that it's closed and shut down right away, which took 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes or something like that. But there's enormous demands for real-time response for managing these systems. So yeah, I mean, I guess, are we saying anything different from the fact that modern life and the digital world is just more complicated? Is that what it comes down to? Or are there some different principles that need to be used? Since you were so brave as to put this one up, would you hire Mr. Cottingham to run this ecosystem here, or would you look for a different set of skills? And if you were going to look for different skills, what would you look for? And are those skills in individuals, or are they in the entire organization?
I wouldn't. I don't know if I'd hire Mr. Cunningham just yet, because I don't know how he would do in this ecosystem. He did seem to have thought about the entire bit about taking the master painter along. So he was definitely thinking more along the lines of what an ecosystem looked like in his day and age. I guess in today's day and age, I'd probably, the only thing to add on to everything else that we've discussed, and probably this is add on to what we've been discussing so far, is that it's also probably important to try and get somebody who's technically, not only technically savvy, but also like legally savvy, or at least like has a good sense of where the regulators and all of that sort of market's going. Because I feel like that seems to be the Achilles heel in tech companies today. There are some companies that tend to deal with regulators better, and they tend to have more of a leeway in terms of what they want to do, whereas others are not doing as well, even though the company by themselves is doing quite well. So I think that's one area I would look for today.
Well, you're making an important point. I mean, the paint industry basically had no regulation back then. Today, there's a lot of regulation around ingredients. For instance, you can't put lead in paint, but there's all 101 other things you can't put in paint anymore as well. So yes, you're absolutely right. The regulatory environment is incredibly complicated. Secondly, there's actually an interesting analogy here that you reminded me of, that in terms of bringing the master painter online, Steve Jobs, the equivalent of the master painter here for at least the iPod story, was the Grateful Dead, because they represented music content, that they were the performing artists that were really upset by the fact that there was illegal downloading going on everywhere, and their royalties from the performances and from songwriting were declining dramatically, and so the studios were also losing money hand over fist, and the artists felt really shortchanged, and Steve Jobs really used the artists, and particularly the Grateful Dead, to get the studios to go along to put their content in the music store so that this whole ecosystem could get kicked off. And there's actually some parallels there. Cottingham also likewise wanted to keep the master painters, keeping the artists on side, and Uber goes the other way and pays the price for it.
Add as well.
Any other comments? Christian, do you have anything to say? Carry on, please.
I'm sorry, I think I have a lag. Can you hear me okay?
Sorry, Ian, did we cut somebody off?
Jackie, go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. The one thing that I would add as well is that I think to run something like Apple versus Sherwin-Williams in the early 1900s, I think you don't necessarily need to have deep expertise in all of these different areas, but you need to be flexible enough and able to think on your feet to get up to speed on all of these different parts of the ecosystem that Apple sits in the middle. So, I mean, Steve Jobs probably did not begin with an in-depth knowledge of artist or creator royalties, or content providers like television stations. They ultimately disintermediated to some extent, or telecommunications operators. But in order to expand all those different areas, you have to get up to speed on that. Whereas I think for Sherwin-Williams, while they did have to gain an understanding of the different types of paint needed for different surfaces, it really was just paint and people that need to paint different things.
It'd been noticed that Sherwin-Williams didn't go out and use contract scientists and outsource the technology for new paints. They actually built an R&D lab in Cleveland and expanded it dramatically over the years. So they figured out that they needed some part of the ecosystem in-house, which was research and development. And remember, back then, most companies didn't have research and development. The model before 1900 in the United States or around the world was to, hire independent contractors if you needed some help on technology. No one had no one had in-house research. It was Edison, Thomas Edison and Edison Labs, and then GE that really, or DuPont before that really showed the value of doing this in-house and using it as an instrument to drive growth. So there are both differences and similarities, and it's good to think broadly about these issues, because I can tell you there's no tried and true and cut and dried answers to a lot of the questions we're discussing here. So the more reference points you have to history, the experience of other companies, or the different ideas, the better. So here is an effort to kind of put together the sensing, seizing, and transforming framework in a bit more in a decision-making framework. This is a paper that I did with Paul Shoemaker, who's professor of decision sciences and finance, actually, at Wharton. Well, he's an adjunct or something like that. Anyway, he was actually a classmate of mine, to be honest. But he tends to think about behavioral economics and decision theory in a more structured way than I do. And so when he looks at dynamic capabilities, he looks down at sensing, how has he defined that? Anticipation and challenges. And you have to be good not just at sensing, but anticipation. So sensing, and to me, an anticipation of close bedfellows here. But I think it's okay if you find it easy to understand by calling it anticipation or opportunity seeking, that's fine with me too. Or recognizing challenges, that's fine too. And then seizing, he sees as being closer to interpretation and deciding. Certainly it's about being decisive. And I think what's happened in the world is we've gotten so good analytically that a lot of companies are stifled by analysis paralysis, because the closer the CFO is to the decision-making process, the more the decision-making process is forced through the lens of the CFO. And the CFO can actually be, a block on innovation if overpowered. That's where good management really has to, sit atop the CFO. But likewise, it's also where a good CFO needs to know when they should bow out of the decision-making process, because there are moments when you don't need the CFO's input because they really can't add very much. And then transforming, in Shoemaker's mind, is more about alignment, it's more about learning. These are different, the same idea, sort of organized something somewhat differently, and it's all about thriving amidst turmoil. And once again, coming back to Sherwin-Williams, there was certainly change in the paint business, but Sherwin-Williams drove most of that change itself. And the kind of turmoil of Silicon Valley and of the digital economy was really not part of the industrial economy. There certainly was periods of rapid change and disruption in the industrial economy, but it's qualitatively different from the digital economy. At least that's my view, and that's the one I wanted to share with you. So here also is the issue of framing of decisions, how do you actually look out and make decisions? You do pay attention to competitive reference points, of course, and that's the Porter framework. But you must also pay attention to mental blocks and decision-making barriers and mental models. I put a lot of emphasis on this. I mean, we all carry around mental models of the world, and sometimes they're very helpful, but sometimes they can get in the way. And as we point out there, the emergence of the iPhone blindsided BlackBerry, which dismissed the iPhone as lacking the sophisticated security features. And yes, indeed, BlackBerry held on some market share. I mean, even Obama, I think in his first period as president, still used a BlackBerry because it had better security. Now, if you want the best security, no longer BlackBerry. BlackBerry is no longer in the market. It's Apple. Apple's got the best security, and they're fighting hard to hold on to it. Whether they can hold on to it, of course, is another story. But just having better security was not enough. Apple caught up and has probably superseded the security that the iPhone have relative to the challenges. I would say is much greater than the BlackBerry, although I'm not an expert in that. Shoemaker also, highlights what he calls highlights and shadows, which is embracing a future-oriented mindset by explaining how goals are set. Jeff Bezos repeats that mantra with "It's always day one," to reinforce that even as they're a big company, they got to be thinking like a startup. Now, can a big company really think like a startup? No, I don't think so. But if you keep trying, you got a better chance to think like a startup than if you don't. And that's why I use this term entrepreneurial management. Entrepreneurial management is really what Jeff Bezos calls day one thinking. The CEO has to walk into the company every day thinking, this is day one. We've got to be thinking afresh and thinking anew about everything we're doing. And then, and Shoemaker's quite good on this, yardsticks and metrics, we do need to measure things. It's not just a matter of finger in the air. And often I've been talking to you as if it is all about intuition. It's not. So Wells Fargo's sales scandal, which you're all aware of, was partly due to bad yardsticks, such as go for great, which is, some false metric that pushed people to make decisions or to seek customers that were inconsistent with maintaining the brand and the overall value system that Wells Fargo had. So yardsticks matter, and sometimes you're better off without some of these metrics, because metrics do tend to drive behavior, and we all know that, and so we've got to be very careful about the metrics that we use. So I think I want to pause there and see if there are more questions. This is really heavy going and a bit repetitive. I don't apologize for that, because sometimes you've got to say things many different ways before people really come to understand them. But let me pause there now and see if there's any connections that you might want to make between what Mr. Hinman said and the general framework of dynamic capabilities. And I'm pausing with the eye. I told you I wanted to finish class early. I wanted to finish at 8:45 here. So we got 6 minutes to try now and see if we can integrate what Hinman was saying into the more general overarching dynamic capabilities framework. Does anyone want to have a crack at making some comments about that? So let's test Mr. Hinman talked about the importance of intangible assets. One way in which you can tie that into dynamic capabilities is he was basically saying that the sensing function of many companies is screwed up. They don't understand the mental models. The mental models that are being used in too many companies are around the world of tangible assets. They're around the world of financial accounting, which doesn't necessarily capture the intangibles. So 2/3 of what he had to say goes to the fact that companies are misdiagnosing the foundations of competitive advantage. And really what he's saying is that banks and the capital markets don't understand where value lies, and that what he's done inside Aon, the dynamic capabilities of Aon, is to create a whole new line of business. Remember, he said he's got $2 billion in the pipeline of new loans for companies into an entirely new market segment. So what are we saying here? Somebody, and I don't know whether it's Brian or whether Aon figured it out first and went and hired Brian, or whether Brian talked Aon into it. We should have asked him that question, and I will follow up with that question. But they've created a whole new financial instrument and a financial market. Now, the question, of course, is, will it work? And maybe these guys are just going to end up losing money, because what they're doing is they're lending money where the collateral is intellectual property. But unlike other companies that would lend and figure out, well, okay, it doesn't matter if it doesn't work out because I've got the intellectual property, I'll go sell the patent portfolio and make money that way. He didn't say it today, but what he told me on the phone was, hey, what they never want to own the collateral. You know, just like a bank really doesn't want to own buildings and they don't want to own automobiles. Aon is going into this not wanting to own collateral at all, but they are willing to lend to companies that have got revenues that are undercapitalized. And, you know, if you can, it sounds expensive if it's 18% money, but if venture capital is 25 or 30 or 40% money, then, you know, the companies will go for it. And in fact, he's got $2 billion in the pipeline, and he's probably, you know, he's told me that for every one loan they make, they probably turn down 19. So there's multiple billions of opportunity coming at him, and he's, you know, it's being innovation. This is innovation. I didn't present it that way, and he didn't talk that way, but really, it's innovation in financial services, using intellectual property and using the value that comes from intangible assets, and not necessarily so much from dynamic capabilities, because he didn't really mention that, other than, you know, we want to see a revenue stream, even if there aren't any profits. It gives them some confidence that there's real value in the intellectual property. So think of it in those terms. It's innovation in financial services driven by sensing and seizing. You know, they're not in the transformation phase yet because they're still early at it. I think they've been at it for 3 or 4 or 5 years, something like that. I'm not exactly sure. So maybe a few years from now, we can write a case study about dynamic capabilities at Aon, and we can talk about the fact that they've opened up an entirely new component, if you will, or segment in the corporate debt market. All right, well, any of you got any closing comments or closing questions, should I say? If not, Ian, remind us what the, we got one more class to go. We've got a spring break, or what is it that's coming up here?
Right, so yes, no class meeting next week for spring break. Then yes, the final session is 6 to 9 p.m. 2 weeks from now, which is Tuesday, March 30th, and we'll likely have at least one guest speaker that time as well.
Yes, so we've got 2 weeks here. I know some of you are on my calendar. Could you want to talk about your papers? I've got some flexibility and more than happy to talk to any of you. And you also have my phone number. If you get frustrated with not being able to find a calendar date, just text me or call me. And if I answer the phone, you know, we can have a conversation. Look, there's a lot of reading that I've thrown at you, probably more than you get in most classes. And you don't have to read it all. It's partly to give you the ability to read that which interests you. I mean, obviously, I expect you to understand this dynamic capabilities framework and the profiting from innovation framework, and that I want to see these ideas and frameworks applied in a meaningful way in your term papers. And you can do them individually, you can do them collectively. You know, I think I put out some guidelines. 10 pages is enough if you're doing it alone. I'm not looking for a page count, to be honest. I'm looking for a clever and insightful application of these frameworks to some real world business circumstance. One maybe that you live every day, one that you observe, or one that you've read about, or if you want to create a fictitious one, that's fine too. But I'm more than happy to chat with you about your papers if you still uncertain about what it is you want to write on. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.